Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Maverick webinar, Who's Watching Who? A Spotlight on Cybersecurity. My name is Karen Allen, and I'm your moderator for this session. Of course, it's the latest in our award-winning webinar series, which is looking at cybersecurity-related issues, and has been inspired by the flurry of news interest following the investigation into the spyware called Pegasus, developed by the Israeli NSO group, which was revealed that South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa was one of 14 leaders whose phone number was on a list identified for potential surveillance. But this webinar isn't just about Pegasus and the company which develops and sells the software. We hope to use today to understand the issues behind the story more deeply and touch on the wider issue of surveillance and spying. So we'll welcome your questions as always, and please put them in the chat. I'd like to thank our Maverick Insiders, Daily Maverick's membership community, for making this conversation possible and ensuring that all of Daily Maverick's content, including webinars, remain free for all. And after this webinar, we will be offering you the opportunity to sign up for First Thing. That's Daily Maverick's free newsletter, which will keep you in the know of all fact-based information. So, without further ado, let's deal with the matter in hand, surveillance. We've got a couple of great panelists today. Happens to be an all-women lineup. May I introduce Shanila Mohammed? She's the Executive Director for Amnesty International in South Africa. She's been fielding a lot of interviews on the Pegasus story in the past couple of weeks. Welcome, Shanila. And Heidi Swart. Heidi is the South African-based investigative journalist, probably familiar to many Daily Maverick readers, who's written some really insightful pieces on the issue of mass and targeted surveillance in South Africa. Welcome to you both. We're going to hear from you in just a minute. Can we start, though, with a poll? It's always quite good to get your feedback and to just understand where the audience is at the moment. So I'd like to consider a brief poll, and we want to get your views on the following question. Should spyware, i.e. the sort of software that includes the Pegasus suite that enables a person's phone or its contents to be tracked, should that be banned? Should spyware be banned? A simple yes/no answer. We'll give you just a little bit of time to be able to cast your votes, if you can do so in the normal way. We're delighted that we're seeing the numbers go up in terms of we've got about 137 people on the webinar at the moment. We'll just take a little bit more time just to get a bit more detail on the poll. So I tell you what we'll do, actually. We'll go back to the poll in a second. And I want to start off with a few questions to our participants. Shenilla, can I start off with you first? It was Amnesty International who broke the story of the leaked Pegasus surveillance campaign after what was really quite an incredible collaboration with other journalists from around the world. I think Citizen Lab in Canada was one of the groups that have been doing some work on this as well in recent years. Look, for the benefit of our audience and for the participants, what is Pegasus spyware and why, in your view, is it so sinister?
Well, good afternoon to all Daily Mavericks audience, and thank you for having us. So why is it sinister, Karen? Because it violates people's basic human rights, right to privacy, right to safety, right to life. There's a number of rights that it violates. But the other really important fact to note about it is that it is very difficult to detect. And as time has gone by, it's become more and more sophisticated. So Amnesty first got interested in this in 2016, when actually one of our researchers, we suspected that they were being targeted. And also there was a Saudi activist, Yahya Asiri, in 2018, who was being targeted. And so we contacted a Citizen Lab in Canada and we asked them if they would run some tests for us. And actually, this is when we first discovered this software. And, Citizen Lab actually proved to us that the software was on these people's phones. And from then on, we've been really interested in the impacts of this. Now, we should be worried because it's not just about a violation of rights. It has got real life consequences. We have seen people die as a result of this software, being put on their phones and those that are targeting them being able to track them and being able to basically carry out extrajudicial killings. So yes, we should be worried because it has very dangerous implications.
We'll get into the debate as to whether it's the software which is the issue, the spyware is the issue, or its use, so the actors, if you like. But and I'll put a question to you in a moment, Heidi, but I think we'll close the poll just to give an indication, because it's quite an interesting result. 65% of our audience, 66% believe that all spyware should be banned. 33% think that it has a place. I'd be interested in your view on this, Heidi. You know, you've written a lot about surveillance issues, and there's quite a lot of nuances. Well, first of all, you know, if you're voting in this debate and you're happy to sort of share your hand, where do you stand on that continuum? Was my first question. And what was your reaction to the Pegasus story when you heard it? I think you're muted. Heidi, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah. So in terms of banning it, I don't think that's the way to go. I think that first of all, I think like any technology, once it's here to stay. You know, it's like nuclear weapons. We would all love for them to disappear, but I don't think they're going to disappear. They're just going to proliferate. And if you put an outright ban on this technology, I think that would just drive it underground. It's already underground. It would just make it even more difficult, really, to get some accountability about it. The other thing is that it has a use. I think many of these companies, like NSO, they do sell it to law enforcement. It is used by law enforcement for legitimate purposes as well. The problem is that we don't have oversight. So we don't always know exactly how law enforcement is using it. And this is so for all surveillance equipment. It's not just spyware. We don't really know how it's being used because everything is cloak and dagger. But also because it gets in the hands of the wrong people and the wrong government. Because, you know, even if a company like NSO says that it has measures in place to ensure that it's doesn't get into authoritarian government's hands, there are other ways for it to get there. There's a black market for it. There are arms brokers and all sorts of ways that they can get around that, that people can get around that to resell this type of thing. It's also easy to resell because it's software and it's it's not like you're trading real guns. So I think for two reasons, then a ban is probably not a good idea because it will make things worse, and because I think we will lose out on a possible legitimate uses of this. Then what was my reaction to the story? I'm not really surprised. I think for the mainstream news reader who is just trying to keep up with politics, this may be something new, but these things are not new. They're not. They are parts of society, intelligence circles, law enforcement circles, the private security industry, where this has been going on for years, and it's a whole world on its own. These types of things really started taking off in the early 2000s as well, along with the rest of the internet. And as the years have gone on and they've sort of received, more and more backlash from the media and from privacy advocates, they've become more and more secretive. They don't have brochures online anymore. So it's not a shock to me. I don't think it's the last we've heard of it, and they're not the only company out there doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a huge industry, and I guess in a way it's the latest incarnation of phone tapping. When you're my grand age, you remember things like Cold War phone tapping and stuff like this, and it's the internet has facilitated stuff like that. Shenilla, I just wonder, actually, just picking up on something that Heidi said, how much then should companies like NSO be put in the dock? Because ultimately they produce the spyware. And as Heidi said, it's not just them. It's a range of different companies. They produce the spyware. They sell it. Sometimes it has legitimate uses, and that legitimate use might be for intercepting transnational criminal gangs, and we have a huge issue in this part of the world with human trafficking, with drugs trafficking, etc. That actually, in a way, the target of your ire should be governments that are using it, not the actual company per se.
Well, I think that, you know, the company should have some accountability sitting with it, because, you know, for example, NSO has actually admitted that they are unable to monitor immediate use of the technology. So, you know, again, there are some international laws that they are violating, because, you know, there's certain laws that restrict the sale of such spyware to countries that have a poor human rights record. But I think the biggest problem, Karen, is that we don't have an adequate overarching framework, you know, where both the users and the developers can be held to account. So they are pieces of international law that can be utilized. You know, for example, you know, NSO has talked about the fact that, you know, this software is great for to use with counterterrorism, but it's never really explained how the design or the use of the tool aligns with the substantial body of work that's been developed around the promotion and protection of human rights. So I think, you know, yes, they are not the end users, they are the producers, but I think that we cannot let them off the hook when it comes to accountability, because at the end of the day, they are not complying with whatever existing laws we have in place. And for example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they don't comply with what's within those laws. So there is an accountability that sits with them.
I'd be interested to see some research, actually. I was thinking about this just the other day, that actually would show us tangible cases of where spyware has ended up resulting in prosecutions or perhaps arrests. I mean, I think there are ways of being able to share this information without actually showing the tools of your trade. But, you know, groups like the NSO, and as I say, we're not going to focus simply on them, but they do say that they do their due diligence, that they do... They don't sell their products to countries with poor human rights records, but ultimately it is the responsibility of the governments themselves that are using the spyware. And to be honest, the same governments that find themselves the recipients of targeting, like South Africa, allegedly, if the investigation is true, also are governments that benefit from exactly this spyware. So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Shenilla.
Yes, Karen. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. But, you know, to be honest, our research in the Pegasus project has shown that, you know, NSO is selling it to countries that have a dismal human rights record. So, you know, they're not being honest about, you know, what they have in place and in order to prevent this. But, you know, yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, nation states have obligations under international human rights law to protect human rights from abuse by third parties. So really, the main duty bearer is the state when it comes to this. And this includes the obligation of states to regulate companies who are domiciled there. So again, you know, in our report, we talk about Israel. I mean, this company is domiciled in Israel, and it's really the responsibility of Israel under international law to ensure that there is effective control to prevent them from causing or contributing to human rights abuses, even if they occur in other countries. So, the company does, as I said earlier, have some legal binding responsibility, but the bulk of it really sits with the governments, and the governments as well. You know, they need to ensure that their citizens are protected. You know, in South Africa, we have a really strong constitution. We have the POPI regulation that has come out now, and you know, if this software is being used on citizens in this country, it's against the constitution, and the state is supposed to protect its citizens. So there are a number of levels of protection and accountability that need to be enforced. You know, while we look for a much more a deeper sort of overarching regulatory framework, we do have some in place. It's not like we're out in the wilderness, but they're not being enforced at the moment.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned POPIA, because that's obviously the Protection of Personal Information Act. It's taken, more than 8 years to actually fully implement. And I think the information regulator is literally hiring as we speak. So, it's been a very, very long, cumbersome process. So when you talk about regulation, it's a fairly slow, lethargic process that is just not keeping up with the technology. Is it a realistic ambition to have the kind of frameworks you talk about? And it's all good and well saying, countries like Israel need to respect international humanitarian law. But if there's not, or international law rather, if they're not, what are the consequences? Because actually there is an appetite for this type of spyware. And again, I come back to the point that in this part of the world, there are about 5 or 6 African countries, Zambia, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, all amongst them, that are using that type of spyware, that also have issues with human trafficking, issues with drugs crime, issues with the ivory trade. And this is a tool in their armory to be able to keep up to speed with the criminals.
Well, I think the question we need to ask is, can we afford not to have the regulatory frameworks in place? I mean, yes, I agree with you that this has been out there, it's been utilized, but, the problems, the reality that we're seeing, and this is what the Pegasus Project has revealed, and this is what, other organizations that, like Citizen Lab, etc., that have been working on this, is that it's not just about monitoring and surveying. It's much deeper than that. It is now about extrajudicial killings. It is now about journalists being targeted, not being able to do their jobs. We in this investigation we did, we saw a journalist in Mexico, Carlos Pineda, who basically his phone was tapped and surveyed 2 weeks before he was killed. So, we are now seeing real life happening as a result of the surveillance. So, the question we need to ask ourselves is, can we afford not to? I mean, do we want a world where, anybody can get up and just decide that they are now going to survey somebody who has said or done something, and, as a result, it's going to end up in their death or in even more severe consequences? So I agree that the regulatory frameworks have taken time. We need to go back and look at the bodies that are creating these. I mean, the UN needs to really step up. Technology is moving much faster than, they can ever. And, we really do need, as civil society, as journalists, as activists, we need to fight for this, because at the end of the day, it is us that is being targeted. Right? It is the journalists, the civil and the activists, and those that are fighting against states that are, repressive and oppressive, that are being targeted by these spywares. So again, people watching this can say, well, you know what? I'm not a journalist or an activist. It's not going to affect me. But actually, it will, because your rights are being curtailed. You don't know at which point what you've said or done that is going to upset a state or a government, and you become a target. So this is not a movie. This is real life stuff. And I think that, we have to ask ourselves, can we afford to allow this to continue unregulated? I agree that banning it is going to send it underground, but it needs regulation. There has to be an accountability mechanism. And as you're saying, there has to be sanctions. So what are the sanctions for those who violate? I don't think that there are tough enough sanctions at the moment, but we have to push for them. And now that we're aware of it, I suppose the question to activists, civil society, organizations like Amnesty and other organizations, what are the next steps? How do we make sure that, these things are now dealt with in a way that the risk to citizens is diminished?
Heidi, you're an investigative journalist. Are you worried about being spied on and being tracked? You're muted.
Sorry. I don't know if I'm high profile enough. I think, look, I sort of always assume that I don't really have any privacy. I kind of assume that there is a virus on my computer. So I've kind of, that I am being watched. I've kind of given up on it, because I don't think, if you really want something to be secret, then you need to get a 2G phone, get yourself an old, Nokia handset, or go and see someone in person and they have to leave their phone at home and you have to leave your phone at home, and then you have to go and meet somewhere, and from that place you have to move on to another place and then to another place and hope they haven't tracked your car, etc. And then you can have your conversation. Those are the lengths that you have to go to, it's ridiculous. You can't not be spied on. You can have a VPN. I think you can have antivirus software. But stuff like Pegasus is, you can't escape from it. You really can't escape from it.
You sound quite fatalistic. Do you think this sort of surveillance culture then is pretty much entrenched, and we've just got to, this is targeted surveillance that we're talking about. But if we think about sort of mass surveillance, and we think about, I say you sign up for your health insurance, or you are involved, for example, in subscribing medical details or your location details because you want to be warned of someone else with COVID-19 who might be within your vicinity. We've almost surrendered our right to privacy up to a certain point, haven't we? And I just wonder whether you kind of get the sense that in South Africa we've kind of have to hold our hands up and say, look, it's part of everyday life now.
No, I think that's the last thing we should do. I think when you're down, when you've hit rock bottom, that's when you really need to start fighting. I think that it all boils down to accountability, and it is very difficult at an international level to have accountability. I mean, it's very difficult to really regulate it internationally, because.
So what about within South Africa? What about South Africa specifically?
Yeah, So in South Africa, we can do something. If you look at our state security agency and our crime intelligence, they have these secret budgets that they can spend on anything they like, and if there's zero accountability for it. Our Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence, I don't think they've ever had a meeting where the public's been allowed to attend. So there is zero transparency, and what they say is, well, we do not want to tell you what technology we're using, or we actually don't want to tell you anything we're doing because it'll jeopardize our operations. That's not true. And I'll give an example of technology and the regulation of technology that's been going on for quite a while, and that where accountability is, sort of out where there is some accountability. So if you take a very sort of, compared to Pegasus, a very simple kind of interception or surveillance, let's look at call data records. Mm-hmm. Police often subpoena mobile operators, and they ask for call data records, which includes who you called, when you called, roughly where you were located when you called, and they use that as supplementary evidence or to corroborate witness testimony. That eventually, those records end up in court, and there are a few examples where they will call in the police officer who did the analysis of the records, and they talk about the technology. They name the technology by name. It's IBM Analyst Notebook. They explain exactly how it works. Okay, so that is one example of how this actually can all be out in the open without jeopardizing operations. And generally speaking, I think people in the criminal world, most of them, the serious ones, they already know how all this stuff works. If they're going to bypass it, they're going to bypass it. I don't think that reporting to Parliament on how you're using public money, with your spyware, to use your spyware, I don't think that's going to jeopardize operations. I think that is just an excuse to be able to spend money on what you want to spend and to use it the way you want to use it.
I guess
I don't think we should give up.
No, I think one of the challenges, surely, Shenilla, is being able to incentivize governments to actually care enough, particularly if they're benefiting from this, to care enough to put in the kind of accountability mechanisms that Heidi's just talked about.
Well, I think, one of the things that Pegasus Project revealed was as you said, the 14 heads of state whose numbers, we felt were compromised. But, maybe that wasn't news to them. I think, in the same way that journalists and activists expect to be, surveyed, I'm pretty sure heads of state also have some sort of expectation. I mean, I'm assuming, but, I think I don't know whether, Karen, there will be enough incentive for these heads of state. I mean, if you think about it, they benefit more than they are at risk. I mean, they are clamping down on journalists. They are, and there's always the test that they fail, that they need to be put to, which is, when they're talking about national security interests, the question that has to be asked is that they've got to demonstrate if it's legal, the necessity, the proportionality, and they never get to be held to account for that. So, my assessment is that a pressure needs to be applied. Okay, we're not going to get a situation where either the companies like NSO or the states are going to happily agree to, frameworks, and because they have more to benefit than they have to lose, and of course, once they target, I mean, look at what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, our report found that not only was his phone contaminated, but so was that of his fiancée, his wife, his children. They knew exactly what, they had every detail of this man's life before he was brutally assassinated. So, so I still believe that it is the citizens, the people, the organizations like Amnesty and Citizen Lab, the media, we just have to keep on pushing for these frameworks, because at the end of the day, we are the ones who are going to suffer if these legal frameworks are not in place. And, the heads of state or the governments will continue to hide behind national security and, other such, terminology, not to be accountable, not to be transparent, and really not to comply with what, in a country like South Africa is the constitutional requirements, and they continue not to comply with it. And they use various excuses not to do so. And I think it's important for us to tear down those excuses and look at them more closely, rather than being afraid. When they throw the word national security, we always start to think, oh my God, what does this mean? Are we going to go to war? But we need to interrogate, what do they mean by that? And, have they done due diligence? Have they been as transparent as they possibly can? But I think, many times citizens don't go there. Once the door is shut, we just wait. There's nothing else that we do. And I think, what we're saying is, we can't afford to just sit back and allow things to unfold.
We've got some really interesting questions from people in the chat. One or two I'm going to go to because I don't want to ignore them, but I have a couple more questions I want to ask you. But just break just from the regulatory issue, just for a few minutes, because there's been some quite interesting observations, and I don't know if either of you have come across this. In terms of some innovations that could be considered that might actually mitigate the excesses of these types of spyware products. Kyle F, I think it might be Kyle Fenley, says, has a more user-friendly tool emerged for checking if you're infected with Pegasus malware? The initial tool requires you to connect your phone to a computer, install development tools, and use a command line tool to check. I guess, for every measure, there's often a countermeasure. I don't know. Let me put it to you, Heidi. Have you come across anyone developing types of software that might actually provide a kind of either an early warning system that you're being spied on, or that's able to effectively block that signal?
So I've spoken to some technicians and people that work with this stuff. The long and the short of it is, well, good luck. I mean, you would have to know what you're looking for to even find it on your phone. And as you can hear from the gentleman's question, is you would have to have some level of know-how. You would have to. I don't think the everyday, the everyday user is going to necessarily manage to protect themselves. It's not if you download a VOS or something on your phone, that's not going to do it. These things are typically, the problem with these things is that they, Pegasus specifically, they prey on faulty code. They prey on vulnerabilities in the software that Google and Apple don't even know about. It's called a zero-day exploit. So it's and the problem also is that it's not like on a computer where you can just install software or antivirus software. You can do a lot of things with your phone to see, are all the security measures that I can have on my phone, in place. But like I said, as you can hear from the question, you'd have to do a couple of complicated things, or you'd have to have your phone forensically analyzed to really know if it's there.
Yeah.
So my answer, the long and the short of it, no, I don't think there is protection that's really accessible for the everyday user. But again, I don't think it's, from everyone I've spoken to, it's not really the everyday user that's going to get in trouble here.
And that's the issue, isn't it? Is that it's very targeted surveillance rather than kind of mass surveillance. And I think, the two are very different things. And we might actually touch upon that a little bit later on. There's an interesting point, actually, Shenilla, that's been made by Antonie van Niekerk. And is the South African national cybersecurity policy adequate or appropriate to manage spyware? So obviously we've got new Cybercrimes Act that has literally just been signed into law. It's sort of the latest tool in the armory to fight sort of some of the scourges of cyberspace. You've mentioned the Protection of Personal Information Act. Are there any kind of protections there within this new cybercrimes legislation, or even I would say sort of within the Constitution more broadly? Because we challenged with RICA, didn't we? So things like slightly different issue, but the physical means of being able to intercept someone's phone and intercept a journalist's phone was actually challenged successfully in South Africa's Constitutional Court. Do we have some legal protections that, if we're smart, we could actually offer much, much greater protection, do you think?
Well, I think we do. And I think South Africans are very fortunate in that, the Constitution, the Cybersecurity Bill Act, all of these do carry some protection. And, again, the Constitution is clear, the POPI is clear, and when it's challenged in the Constitutional Court, when any sort of violations are challenged, they are dealt with, in accordance with the law. So I think South Africans are very fortunate. And definitely, it's all about now the utilization of those really solid legal frameworks. But, again, let's remember that many countries in Africa and across the world do not have the regulatory frameworks that South Africa has. And again, if you look next door in Zimbabwe, I mean, they don't have anything like this. We see it across the board in South America. We see it in many countries of the world. And, so yes, in countries where there are strong constitutional democracies, there are safeguards and protections. But in many countries in the world where these dictatorships, where these repressive regimes reside, there aren't those protections. And therefore, we do have to look at protections within international law and international legal frameworks in order to provide some protection to the activists, the journalists, the targeted, those that are being targeted. So, it's important to think in a global way as well as in a localized way, because the implications of this is quite huge globally. And there are very few countries like South Africa, particularly, I think it's probably one of the only ones in Africa that has the type of legal framework that we have. So, that should just tell you about, how brutally the spyware can be used in countries that don't have those protections.
Without sounding too negative, how realistic is it to be able to get sort of an international consensus on the use of this type of software, when actually what this boils down to, and this comes up in so many of our other cyber webinars, is that there are different ideologies, there are different norms in terms of where countries stand on the kind of privacy, freedom of information versus security spectrum, because that's effectively what this boils down to. What trumps what? Should security trump freedom of expression and trump privacy, or where along that continuum? If we can't get African countries at the African Union to decide where they stand and have one common voice, how can we expect that realistically to happen internationally, Shenilla, to be able to put the kind of protections that you talk about in place?
Well, when following 9/11, when we had this whole, anti-terrorism drive where people's rights were being violated, at every step of the way, we did succeed in getting some legal frameworks or international legal frameworks in place, counter-terrorism frameworks that really, looked very seriously at the protection of human rights while countering terrorism. So, if we could do that, I don't see why it's not possible to really push for some form of regulatory, overarching regulatory framework. I'm not saying that, states are going to use them all the time or that it's going to be easy. Definitely not. But, we saw post 9/11 how, the whole, everything that was being done in the name of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism was really a violation of people's rights, depending on their ethnicity, their religion, who they were, freedom of movement. Guantanamo Bay is still there as an example of those rights violations. So, it's not impossible. And I think that, we have to put the protection of human rights at the center of everything, because it's, states will use the issue of security in order to block human rights at every step. And I think, if we sit back and say, well, it is what it is. We live in a world where we're scared, where there are terrorists out there, where people are going to come and kill us. So let the state do what they want. I fear that, we are giving in, or we are creating a world that is not going to be safe. It's going to be even less safe than it is now, because it will really be much easier to conduct extrajudicial killings. It'll be much easier just to kill people if you're, a state to do that. And we see it with certain repressive states like Saudi Arabia. It's already happening. This is not like it's not happening. So, in answer to your question, yes, it's not going to be easy, but we have to keep pushing for it, and we have to keep insisting on it, because otherwise, what is the alternative? The alternative is frightening.
Heidi, I've got a really interesting question that's come up from Tara O'Connor, and she's looking at this from a kind of commercial prism, if you like. She says, privacy has become Apple's unique selling point. Facebook's WhatsApp claims that messages and calls are end-to-end encrypted. This is a commercial issue. These companies have made promises to consumers. Surely we have recourse to them to protect users. Could it be kind of approached from a kind of consumer protection point of view, do you think? Red flagging good performers and bad performers, if you like, in the same way that, in a sense, you have a kite marking scheme for certain pieces of technology or certain products which are reach a certain threshold. That you're muted.
I don't know if they can do. Look, let me put it this way: for something like Pegasus, okay, if we're going to go to Apple and Google and say, look, how is this, how is this happening? You guys should be keeping an eye on this. There are some very smart people looking for vulnerabilities in their operating system, and these people are doing it full time. It's not just organizations like Pegasus. The looking for zero-day exploits is an industry all on its own, and it's a multi-million-dollar industry.
And it's done with machines, isn't it? Often, Heidi. Sorry to interject, but often it's not literally one man or woman huddled over a laptop looking for those vulnerabilities. They use machine learning to be able to spot those loopholes, if you like.
Yeah, so it's an automated industry to some extent, but yeah, it's happening on a grand scale. Yeah, really. Let's just put it that way. So I think Apple and Facebook would have to spend, I think they already spend significant amounts, obviously, on their security. They would have to probably increase that. I'm speaking under correction. The thing is it really worth it for them? Because if you take a news story like Pegasus has been around for a while. This thing first came out in 2016. There was a nice big article in Vanity Fair about Bill Marczak, who was the first one to really, find this stuff from Citizen Lab, when he was just a student. So, and since then, Citizen Lab has been publishing quite a, in-depth and quite shocking, news about this and how it works. Now there's been a big media exposure again. In a few days from now, people are probably going to forget about it. And Apple and Google will, and Facebook, etc., they'll just keep repeating their normal marketing, strategy where they say, we're keeping you safe, we're keeping everything private, we've got end-to-end encryption. And I don't know if it's worth it for them to employ additional armies of, white white hat hackers. I don't know if that's worth it for them.
Yeah. I want to put a question to you, Shenilla. We've been focusing on targeted surveillance, and notwithstanding some of the grave and justifiable concerns that you've raised, it is a smaller number of people that would be targeted. And as I say, it's not to in any way diminish the scariness and the questions that are raised about that. But shouldn't we be as worried about mass surveillance, about bulk surveillance, the fact that we walk down the road and there are CCTV cameras picking up at every move, or I go and register with Home Affairs and there's my biometric data that is determining. We hear a lot about the spyware. We don't hear quite so much about the fears of mass surveillance, which, let's face it, is actually exposing many, many more of us to surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that, we've started as societies to just accept these things as the norm. I mean, we accept that we walk, in South Africa, we see because of crime, and the reason given for, that we see cameras, even in suburbs, at every corner of the street, in complexes that we live in, we see surveillance. And so we've started to accept this as a norm, and without even questioning, really going back to those things about, is it legal, is it necessary, and is it proportional? We don't question it at all. And I think, that for me is one of the major concerning things about really what this type of technology is doing to people. We've started to just believe that, this is necessary without questioning. And I think that, and I agree that, these conversations around this type of spyware have been out for a while. But, I think, we really are becoming societies that are becoming very passive around the loss of our, identities, the loss of our, personal information, it's just quite worrying. And I think, one of the things is that it's not being challenged in the way that, it should be. Really, we need to have organizations or people challenging it. I mean, one of the things that we're calling for as a result of this Pegasus project is, a path to remedy for individuals who have been targeted in violation of their human rights. So, if companies and states know that, a violation will be targeted or will be, they would have to pay for it, then maybe it won't happen. But I think you're right. We need to be more worried, because I think, we're being brainwashed into believing that everything is being done for our own good. That we are being, asked to give up all this information, etc., for our own protection, for our own safety. And yes, there is an element of that. I'm not totally being negative and dismissing that. But I think, where it doesn't feel right, we really do need to question it rather than go ahead and just do what is asked of us. I see it in my son. I mean, he is 28 and, he gets asked, and he constantly asks questions like, why do I need to supply this? Is it necessary? I don't actually recall seeing this in the thing. And I think we need to start asking those types of questions, because otherwise, we just comply with everything, and suddenly we become a highly regulated, highly tracked, and very surveyed society. And then, it's in total violation of our basic rights. And I think, that's what we need to understand, that we have the right to say no. If it's in violation of our basic human rights, we don't have to agree to everything, especially not in a country like South Africa that has a legal framework that is for the protection of rights.
I think it's such an interesting point, and it's interesting you make reference to your son. You look far too young to have a 28-year-old son, but that's another conversation over a cup of coffee. But I actually wonder if there's a generational aspect to this, because actually what you've talked about is trading personal privacy for convenience of access or extra points. I won't name the individual companies that offer this, but you surrender a certain amount of privacy, and in return you get something. You get a sense that you're being rewarded in some way. Heidi, just with your observation, is there a generational element to this as well? Do you, again, just when you talk to people in South Africa, are younger people, given the fact that they're much more, and of course this is a wide generalization, and obviously we don't necessarily mean Daily Maverick readers, because obviously they're all far too aware of what the potential pitfalls are. But actually, seriously, do you get a sense that actually younger people who've grown up with mobile phones, who've grown up with data as part of their sort of everyday existence, are actually much more willing to give up that information for the convenience? And we're almost having to re-educate, or at least have more conversations about the potential pitfalls. You know, it used to be the case you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. That was always the argument against ID cards. Do you think now with a younger generation, we're almost having to have the conversation again about what could potentially happen with your data? We're muted.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it, Karen. I think I don't think one can necessarily sort of say it's just one age group. I think everyone, really, I think everyone is perhaps fatigued by the idea that our data is just not ours anymore. And I think younger people, one often thinks they should have more know-how and they should have, they should be more tech savvy. But I think, well, Facebook came around when I was still pretty young, and all those, protections were there, and I was kind of, really, I was quite aware of my settings and so forth. But now, 10 years later, I've kind of given up, because the settings are just getting more and more complicated, and there's just a one news story after the other breaking about, this data leak and that data leak.
Yeah.
So if I look at myself, I think over time I've become sort of more weary. You get more wary, but you also get more weary. Mm-hmm. And I think, even for the younger generation, there's just there are just too many buttons to push. There are just too many settings, and people are too busy. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think
becomes a norm.
I think we're all in the same boat. I think we're all getting to a point that generally people are just, you can't even open a bank account without a smartphone anymore. It's just part of how it is. It's becoming, surrendering your data in exchange for a convenient service is really the norm, and we all we kind of got sucked into it without really knowing. If I knew 10 years ago or 15 years ago what Facebook would become, I would never have joined. Never. And in a sense, I fear that it is too late, really, for us we can't really back from the data economy. But I think this is not just a generational thing. I think we are all overwhelmed.
I think that's a good observation. I mean, Shenilla, that we're hearing really surveillance by stealth almost. That it's eventually accumulated and it's become so much part of the kind of everyday ecosystem in which we operate. I'm just wondering, rather than spending large amounts of money and time trying to regulate internationally and possibly getting quite frustrated in the process, isn't in some circumstances one of the solutions actually is massive public education and digital literacy? Because albeit with the Pegasus spyware, it's the latest incarnation is such that you don't even know that it's on your telephone. You don't actually have to click on a link. But with many other sort of slightly sinister types of software, you do have to click on a link. And actually, wouldn't that be money better spent? Because we're very good in South Africa about bringing in legislation, and we'll find a law for it. We'll write a law for it. But actually, you could have huge impact with a wider sort of digital literacy campaign for the general public.
I think it has to be a combination of both. I mean, I think, literacy is always important, and it's always important for people to know what is happening, but also to know what their rights are around it and how they, can and cannot, deal with any violations of their own rights. But I also, honestly, I refuse to be disheartened, because I really feel that, if there are people out there that can create this type of sophisticated software. There are people out there that can find ways to block it. There are people out there that can work on ways of ensuring that, people's rights are protected. Look, it's not easy. We know that, it's complicated. Even, Amnesty Tech, I mean, if you go into the amnesty.org website, I mean, we've got our full technical report on this, and you can see that, it requires somebody with real skills and an understanding to be able to do this. We understand that, and we know that. But I suppose it's really more about so on the one hand, yes, the literacy is important for the less malicious type of activities that are out there, where people know their rights and whether or not they should be handing over information or not, and we that's important. But I think on the other hand, it is important for us to continue to fight for regulations, and it is important for us to continue to counter, some of these, the way in which these spywares and other types of technology are being used, because, otherwise we really are giving in to an industry that is not regulated, that is literally the wild west, being able to do whatever they want. And, is that really the world that we want to create? So, again, it's got to be a combination of both. I don't feel that we can just say, okay, let them just do what they want. It's fine. We're just going to learn about what we can control and leave what we can't control. Because, again, the question is it really, if maybe in 2-3, maybe it's the youth that are going to come up with the answers to dealing with these types of sophisticated types of malicious spyware that are being used. And yes, not to say that spyware doesn't have a place in society. We know that it does, but unfortunately, it's the lack of regulation that is worrying us. The fact that it's being misused that is worrying us, not the fact that this can be used for good. And it's that aspect that we feel needs to be given more attention to.
Shenilla, an interesting question from Donnelly McClelland, who's one of the participants who's joined us online, said, I'd love to know how many of those 50,000 phone numbers, and this was Amnesty's claim, there were 50,000 phone numbers that were earmarked for potential surveillance. How many of those 50,000 phone numbers were known or suspected criminals? Was that reported on at all?
No, that's not. So most of these numbers were really numbers, that we got from the partner, the journalists, the other, so we didn't break it down.
There could be quite a lot of criminals among them.
Yeah, there could be, exactly. But I can't give you a statistic on how many of the 50,000 were, because it's not something that we broke down as part of we were looking at whether these numbers had traces of the spyware on it. But I think it's a really important question, and it's something that I will take back to the Amnesty Tech team. I mean, maybe they did look at it. It didn't come out in the report, but it's an important question.
It would certainly skew the reporting on it, wouldn't it? Because actually, if a sizable proportion, even 20-30% of these were criminals, and we've got huge issues with transnational crime, I think it would be a very, very different conversation that we'd be having.
Well, I think it would be different to some extent, but I still think that, you know, the core of the conversation would be the same from our perspective, that it would really be around, you know, the rest of the people, you know, and those who are not criminals, those who are not, you know, being surveyed for criminal activities or trafficking or whatever. What about their rights? You know, what about their the surveillance that's happening with them? So again, it wouldn't prevent us from making the same calls, which are really about regulation and having a regulatory framework in place, and also accountability and calling out states that are violating or companies that are violating the existing international legal frameworks that we have in place.
We're nearly at the end. I've got a question I want to put to you, Heidi, sort of journalist to journalist. And this is quite interesting, you know, where the line is between spying or acquiring information. You know, we have these now open source tools which are available to be able to identify where people are, where they're geolocated, where they're able to, you know, what the phone calls that they make. It's now part of commonplace journalistic investigations. It's called open source investigations. Is there an awful lot of difference between that? And we know that these tools are also being used by investigators, they're being used by the police, they're being used by the intelligence services. Is there really a lot of difference between that and the type of spy that we're talking about? Just a bit muted.
Sorry. Okay,
That's
so
okay.
That has to do with big data analytics, whereas Pegasus is very targeted. So you have to know whose phone you want to get to. You have to know something about the phone. It's a mission. Big data analytics, I mean, they have bots crawling the social media sites and picking up, you know, on certain themes. For commercial companies do that. Marketing companies do that to see the sentiment of consumers. Spy companies do that to, you know, or governments do that to pick up on potential terrorist activity, potential dissident activity. You know, where's the process? Is there a protest brewing? Is there violence brewing, etc.? So it's a very different type of technology where because there's so much open source data. That you really need to have automated analytics running to see what is important. And there are plenty of products, you know, OSINT products out there for law enforcement officials and, you know, for governments, intelligence agencies. I don't think people understand how invasive it is because they are able to, you know, within a few seconds, pull together a lot of information about you and profile you and, you know, see what you're doing on a daily basis. As we generate more and more data, especially with IoT, you know, the Internet of Things that will start to proliferate, there will be more and more, you know, data about each individual out there. So basically what the government and law enforcement services have done is they've done what Google you know, has been doing all along, and what Facebook has been doing all along, and what marketing companies have been doing all along, you know, profiling people. So you start off broadly and you pick up someone from out of, you know, millions of users, and you know, okay, this is the person I now want to target. So whereas this, you know, social media monitoring is sort of, you know, does a constant sweep of what's going on, and okay, you know, now we have someone to target, and now you'll employ the spyware. Now you'll find that person and employ the spyware like Pegasus. So it's a sifting process versus, okay, now we've got our guy, we're going for him or her.
Thank you both very much indeed. We're near the end of our session here. I think I'm quite keen to end on a thought from one of the participants, actually, Andrea Lee, who said, "This Pandora's box is wide open. I have learnt a lot. I would not vote yes now." So yes to our original poll question was, should spyware be banned? I would not vote yes now with all this information to hand. Not logical. Thank you very much indeed. And my thanks to both of you, to Heidi and also to Shenilla. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time and for your insights. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion, and we've enjoyed having you as guests on this webinar. We've also enjoyed our audience supplying so many interesting questions and comments. Thank you very much for your questions too. And please do remember to consider signing up to First Thing, the Daily Maverick's free newsletter, which will keep you in the know of all fact-based information. We're looking forward very much to our next webinar in our cybersecurity series. Until then, thank you, and just look out that no one's watching over your shoulder. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everyone.